All right, we are winding down on our three variables that impact your final exposure. Now we're going to take a look at shutter speed. Shutter speed is quite literally the amount of time that the shutter is allowed to remain open during exposure. In the early days of photography, a shutter speed of a minute or 2 minutes or even 10 or 15 minutes was fairly common. But in today's modern equipment, shutter speeds can be as short as 1/1000th, 1/2000th, even as fast as 1/8000th of a second. As with aperture, adding a stop of shutter speed is equivalent to doubling the amount of light that reaches the sensor. So if I were to go from, say, 1/2 of a second to 1 second, I would be doubling the amount of light that reaches the sensor because I'm leaving the shutter open twice as long. Likewise, if I subtract a stop of shutter speed, say going from 1/8 of a second to 1/16th of a second, I would be cutting the amount of light in half that reaches the sensor. Shutter speed ultimately will dictate the appearance of motion in your images. Using a fast shutter speed will allow you to freeze the action of a fast-moving subject. Here we see an athlete that's going over the high jump bar, and because she's in fast motion and her hair is swinging around, the photographer has chosen a really short shutter speed, a fast speed shutter, to be able to freeze the motion so that she is still in sharp focus. Notice also that because they're using a really fast shutter speed, they're also using a very wide open aperture to get lots of light in as fast as possible. And by using that wide open aperture, they've given themselves a very narrow depth of field. The result is that all of the people in the background in the bleachers and stands are blurry and out of focus. In this particular case, that's a double benefit because it forces the viewer's eye to look at the athlete and not be distracted by the busy background. Today's modern cameras are capable of shutter speeds of 1/1000th of a second, even 1/2000th of a second without any special accommodations. That's really good for general purpose photography. If for some reason you really needed the stop action capabilities of a very, very, very fast shutter speed, we can take this image into the studio setting where we can control our light much better. With an image like we see here with a bullet going through a light bulb, this was created in a studio where the ambient light, or the amount of light in the room naturally, was taken way down by turning off the lights. And then we leave our shutter speed open for as long as we want, a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. But then the only source of illumination comes from a flash. A flash unit can give you a duration of light that might last only 1/50,000th of a second, or even 1/100,000th of a second. And because the room itself is dark, the only source of illumination for the subject is that strobe or that flash. So by lighting the image with only that strobe or that flash, we effectively give ourselves an image with a shutter speed that is equivalent to the duration of the flash. So in this case, 1/100,000th of a second, or thereabouts, is enough to freeze the action of the bullet going through this light bulb. Conversely, using a really slow shutter speed will allow you to accentuate motion. The faster an object is moving and the slower the shutter speed, the more blur that you'll get. Notice here that the people on the swing are moving much faster and therefore they are blurred. But the stationary object here in the center, the pillar that supports the entire swing, that's not moving. And so therefore it's recorded in sharp focus. One creative technique that you can use that utilizes shutter speed and a slow shutter speed is a technique known as panning. In this case, you have a bike rider who is moving through a stationary background. Conventional wisdom would say that the background would be in sharp focus and the rider would be blurry. But by panning the subject, we're going to keep our camera focused on the rider and actually move the camera during the exposure, keeping the rider in the center of the focus. therefore keeping the rider in sharp focus and letting the background go completely blurred. If nothing in your final image is sharp, there's a good chance that your shutter speed is just too long for your camera to be handheld. This happens a lot when we're looking at a low light situation where you might see a shutter speed of a half second or even a full second or longer. In this situation, you've got a couple of options. You can raise your ISO so that you can give yourself a shutter speed and aperture combination that will allow a faster exposure, or try using a tripod or some other way to brace yourself against a stationary object like a wall or a fence that will allow you to keep your camera steady throughout the exposure. Bear in mind that things that are not moving will remain sharp in your image. Things that are moving may still tend to show a little bit of motion blur. So try to get yourself a shutter speed that will accommodate freezing the action of the subjects that are moving around within the image. Another technique that utilizes a long shutter speed or a slow shutter speed is a technique known as intentional camera movement. And this is basically where you're choosing a slow shutter speed and actually moving the camera intentionally throughout the exposure. If we look at this particular image here, we can see that this seems to be the point around which everything rotated. So the photographer likely focused there and then rotated the camera around that axis as the shutter was open, creating more blur out towards the edges of the image, creating this really interesting sense of motion throughout the image. Many of us have seen images like this of star trails, which is a great example of an extremely long exposure. Exposures like this might be created over the course of hours overnight, or could be created as a series of shorter exposures that were then stitched together in post-processing. Typical SLR cameras will give you the opportunity to shoot an exposure of up to about 30 seconds without requiring any additional accessories. If you're looking to create an image like this with a shutter speed open much longer than that, you'll likely require some sort of an additional hardware like an intervalometer or your cell phone connected to your camera with an app that will allow you to give you longer shutter speeds. Bear in mind that when you're using these really long shutter speeds, using a tripod becomes absolutely essential, as there's just no way to hold your camera steady for that long without the tripod giving you support. And that pretty well wraps up our introduction to the three basic variables of the exposure triangle. We looked at ISO, or film speed, we looked at aperture, and we looked at shutter speed. Next week, we'll take a look at the 5 basic categories of different lenses that will mount onto your digital SLR cameras, including wide-angle lenses, normal lenses, telephoto, super telephoto, and a whole slew of specialty lenses like macro lenses, fisheye lenses, tilt-shift lenses, and more. So join us next week as we take a look at wide-angle distortions, telephoto compression, nifty-50, portrait lenses, and just how many lenses do you need to carry in your bag to be ready to get the shot no matter what.